Hello, everyone. Welcome to Foresight's Neurotech Group. And today we'll have Nathan Helm-Burger here, and he'll be talking about how understanding the human connectome can help with AI interpretability and AI safety. So with that being said, welcome, Nathan. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for coming. So I think that this talk is not a lot of content in terms of research to show, but I think you'll find it interesting. I think a lot of you will be familiar with the localization within the human brain of particular functions, how someone can lose something as specific as their grammar for their speech due to a stroke, or their vocabulary, and that the motor cortex, for instance, is organized in very specific regions that control parts of the body. And that kind of localization, if we could instantiate it within an AI model, would be great for interpretability and control. So that's the basic idea here. I also think that necessarily this involves understanding certain things about the way the brain is set up that implies that we could do something like a lo-fi brain emulation that's computationally feasible. I do think that there are a lot of concerns with that kind of approach to work out before it would make sense for that to be tackled as a scientific project. I just want to say I'm not proposing that someone run out and try to make as close to a human brain as possible model yet. I think you need to be really thoughtful about what parts of the brain you include versus exclude in terms of things like emotions and self-awareness and things like that. So first, I'd like to introduce this concept of a bottleneck for information. So in the compute graph of a transformer, you have, for example, attention heads, and then a feed-forward MLP, and then a residual stream. And often with the transformer, that the residual stream is something like 70%, something around 2/3 of the size of the feed-forward MLP. So that is a slight bottleneck. You can see the narrowing here, the sort of funnel down to the residual stream. Now I'm going to use the same kind of representation to indicate the bottleneck between two areas in the cortex. So looking at two areas that are very closely connected, V1 and V2, if you think about what your intuitive sense of the ratio of connections between the areas versus within the areas is, and each of them has a bit fewer than 10 million neurons, so that's a rough amount. So the number of axons going from V1 to V2 or vice versa has recently been found to be a surprisingly small number. What you're actually looking at is just 1% or so of the neurons from V1 actually reaching over to connect to V2. So this bottleneck here is not 100% down to 70%. You're talking about 100% down to 1%. And that's between two immediately adjacent, highly connected regions. And this connectivity falls off with the power law for regions that are further away from each other in the brain. So you're often talking about average connectivity of just a small fraction of a percent. 0.1% is common. So that's an actually quite dramatic bottleneck. And I think is the thing that is responsible for this very general learning architecture that we have in the cortex becoming so highly functionally localized, because you have to come to some kind of conclusion in a region and compress that conclusion into a form that can efficiently be sent over this narrow bandwidth to the next region. So if we look at some stats here in terms of connectivity, you have anywhere from 100 to 100,000 axons connecting to brain regions. And these long-range axons are not the fastest firing neurons in the brain. They are low average. It's quite common in a period of 10 milliseconds that you will see 0, 1, or 2 firings, and occasionally 3. it's possible to have many more than that, but it's increasingly rare, such that the average firing rate is just 1.1. And this allows us to have some calculation of the amount of information that's passing through every second. So over the course of a second, that there's going to be a bunch of different 10 millisecond periods. So the chance that a particular axon is completely silent for that entire second is low, because there needs to be high utilization of these relatively very rare axons. So you don't have a lot of these axons just sitting silent for long periods of time. So you're seeing something like an average firing rate of around 70 times per second. And importantly, the information that is carried by these action potentials is binary, in that an action potential either fires or doesn't. There's no strength directly associated with a given action potential, but it carries information in terms of its rate. So the interval between action potentials on a given neuron is an indication of scalar value that axon is conveying. And for these long distance axons between brain region, they're all excitatory. There's not inhibitory axons. They may connect directly onto inhibitory neurons to cause the next result downstream to be inhibitory, but they themselves are excitatory neurons. Using this sort of rough approximation of the information that this firing rate can convey, both with the direct firings themselves and spacing between them, you get about 400 bits per axon per second, which means you have something like 5 megabytes per second between two very closely connected regions like V1 and V2. And for many of the regions in the brain, you have much lower, like 0.5 megabytes per second. So this is actually something that is a lot lower than the connectivity that you would expect to see between two different computers and two different data centers somewhere around the world. Also, you have to consider the fact that action potentials are quite slow compared to transmission through fiber optic cables or through electrical cables for computer communication speeds. So you're also looking at internet latencies that would be similar between two areas in the brain as between two data centers on opposite sides of the earth. So this shows us that it really is feasible to have something that's distributed over all computers on earth that is as connected as different regions of our own brains, which is mind-boggling to think about. And I think the fact that people haven't really considered the implications of this information, which has been known for quite some time. This isn't new information I've discovered. This is just me looking up from a bunch of different papers these figures about neurons that have been measured years ago, and putting this into the context of what it would mean if we had a distributed AI system with power on the order of the human brain. So that leaves you wondering, like, where is the complexity coming from in the computation with the human brain? Because if you think about this kind of low bandwidth, low speed, simple kind of binary communication, that doesn't seem like it fully conveys the richness of human expression of ideas over time. And so I think it's worth keeping in mind that there's a much richer connectivity that's both excitatory and inhibitory and looping in lots of different ways and very sparse within a given region in the cortex. And so that's where we get this sort of local richness and non-local sparseness. And so now I want to take another look, zooming in a little more. So when you have two brain areas communicating with each other, you don't actually have all the axons bundling together and then redistributing randomly onto the next area. what you actually have is topographic patterns. So there's a particular region of V1 that communicates to a subset of the axons that are going over to V2, and that then communicates to a particular region within V2. And this same topographic pattern is represented all throughout the brain, that you don't get this particular region, this subdomain or patch of a particular brain area able to choose to directly communicate with a different patch downstream. These long-range axons are formed during fetal development and are locked in place for the duration of a person's life. And if you lose these axons, these long-distance axons can't regrow. You can regrow local connections or find alternative paths through local areas, but the long-distance axons are irreplaceable. These are part of what is the most fundamentally you about you, one of the least replaced parts of your body for your entire life, that if you were to lose it would fundamentally change something about who you are in a permanent way. So that's really important. And the fact that this is set by your genes before you're even born, your genes in your fetal environment, is also quite important. The main way that people end up with differences other than genetics in these long-range connections is that you are given as an infant more than you need and you prune some away. So that pruning process happens throughout childhood, and that sort of does allow for some specialization of the long-range connections. But other than that, you are working off of a very similar architecture between all humans. And indeed, primates and mammals all have a lot of these genetic long-range connection patterns in common. So this is highly evolutionarily conserved. So I want to think about, share this idea of information flow through the brain in the metaphor of warp and weft, like weaving on a loom. So if you think about these local regions, they can communicate to any other local region within their group. And often they are locally inhibitory and then exciting regions further away from themselves. And their strongest connections are within themselves, a patch. So you have this ability to communicate back and forth between this group until each one has come to its conclusion about whatever is going on. And then that particular group is going to pass to its dedicated subset of neurons its very compressed message, which will go to its sister neuron group over here in this brain area that it is permanently connected to. And then all of these areas will be getting signals at around the same time, and then they will all confer with each other. So you have this zigzaggy pattern of information and these dedicated regions, which oddly enough are, even though these are far apart in physical space and there's a significant delay in them communicating to each other, in a certain way, these sister regions are more tightly interconnected than they are to the regions around them in the same brain area, because they necessarily must communicate to each other. They don't have the option of communicating to anyone else in a different group. So that's a constraint that's placed on the system that I think is key for this functional localization, and is something that I think is possible for us to replicate and experiment with in ML architectures, and is something that, to my knowledge, has not been tried in this exact pattern before. So that's basically the heart of my proposal. And I think this is what results in each of these nodes, each of these parcellations or areas in the brain, like V1, V2, orbital frontal cortex, those sorts of places, becoming a model or agent or cohesive entity, computational entity in its own right. And then those subregions within it that have a particular fixed set of inputs and fixed set of outputs, and a set of columns, cortical microcolumns within themselves that communicate closely with each other. That forms these little groups of groups. And so all the way down to the neuron level, you find this repeated pattern of neighborhoods that are most closely connected to each other, and then less closely connected to neighborhoods further away. And that makes a sort of fractal self-similarity in the organization of the brain. And these particular specialized subagents within each region can compete with each other to declare something about the sensory information coming in, or to output a potential motor plan to go out. And they do mutual inhibition to decide between themselves who is the most confident about being correct. So if you want to draw out this connectome between all the different regions of the brain, it gets pretty complicated pretty fast. This is just the visual system, and it's really difficult to visually trace all the different lines connecting all these different parts. But there's a much simpler way to visually represent this, which is with a heat map. And you can see that this is not necessarily perfectly symmetrical, but shows you the strength of some particular area. This is the left primary auditory cortex. How strong would that connection be to Broca's area here? And you can look and see the direct connection between them. And something notable about connections in the brain is that there are a lot of them. It's not just one specific straight path through the brain. These are very circular connections with information moving back and forth, and to lots of off-target areas. So we need to think carefully about how to make sense of this kind of highly circular compute graph, which is very different from our current ML architectures. So first, I'll go over a little bit more in detail about these nodes in the network, as I'm calling them, the parcellation areas, the regions. Within these, you have these microcolumns in the cortex, which each of these works as a close-knit community to come to a particular conclusion and output a particular plan. And each of these may have one or maybe no direct outputs to some other area. So these are mostly talking, and by other area far away in the brain, but they do have dense connections to these neighboring columns. You see these forming associations, and these associations, unlike the long-range axons in the brain, these associations are very temporary. They're very experience dependent. These are territories that spontaneously form throughout your life and can change as your experiences change. For instance, if this is taken from a macaque monkey, non-human primate, so if this particular monkey was placed in a situation where it needed to grasp things a lot, but never needed to defend itself from other monkeys, you might see this grasping area over the course of a few weeks slowly expand and take more of these microcolumns into its territory, and the defense area might shrink. And so you'd have more motor plans devoted to complex grasping behaviors and fewer motor plans devoted to defense. And so this shows you really that there's an intense level of flexibility within this functional localization, while still maintaining their very specific roles, because it doesn't suddenly become a vision area over here. What it becomes is a member of its neighboring region, which is still just doing motor plans for the arms in this particular case. So there's both a sort of macro scale lock-in of particular functionality, while there's, at this very local scale, a flexibility where the microcolumns can change which territory they're supporting on a daily or weekly basis even. And similar organizations in the sensory cortex where you have local regions that split up the responsibilities between themselves, where in this case, each of these little squares is a cortical microcolumn, and each one has a slightly different role in detecting a particular line orientation. These groups of microcolumns then will all concur that they're detecting a line with this orientation in their appropriate part of the visual field, and suppress the line orientations that are nearby them to distinguish the fact that the line is precisely like this and not like these slanty ones in other directions. But it's only going to weakly inhibit these guys over here that are completely perpendicular. So if you see a crossed line, you can totally have an activation in these two. And then if you tilted your head slightly such that the cross was tilted slightly, you might suddenly have an activation in these two relatively far apart regions. So something I want to highlight here is that these long distance connections in the brain have particular types to them. And for the cortex in particular, there's three main types that I'm going to call feed forward, feedback, and other, which the other I think is useful to think of as a contextual connection. So these feed forward connections, such as V1 connecting to V2, drive the downstream area. So if you silence V1, V2 also goes silent, because what V2 is doing is predicting the next output of V1 given the information that it previously had about V1. And so in this sense, V2 is being driven by V1. It has a sort of job in the brain that is defined by where the neuron axons from V1 connect into the columns in V2. And this is what conveys that relationship between the two. And that's, again, locked in during fetal development by genetic signals where the axons know what particular layer of the cortex they're supposed to end up in, even though they have to travel a long way to get there. And similarly, when you're making those feedback connections from V2 back to V1, they know what particular cortical layer within the microcolumns they are going to be targeting. And this results in them having a different relationship with their downstream areas, their upstream areas. So if you silence V2, that does not cause V1 to go silent in the same way that silencing V1 causes V2 to go silent. So it's not a driving connection anymore because it connects to a different set of neurons in a different set of layers across all these different cortical mini columns. So what you're doing with the feedback is something like giving an error signal, as is discussed in predictive coding, which probably a lot of you are familiar with. But something that I think is not emphasized enough when people are talking about predictive coding is that the brain has tons and tons, the cortex has tons and tons of connections between these areas in the brain that are neither the feed forward nor the feedback. They're this other kind. They're relatively sparse inputs from relatively distal areas, giving each other contextual clues that are not the thing that is the target of prediction during this predictive coding, but they are contextual clues that help with that prediction. So you have auditory inputs going into even the low-level visual areas, that giving these visual areas a little bit of clue about what might be coming up to be seen based on what kinds of sounds are being heard, and vice versa. So this helps all the different areas have clues as to what is going on, even in the off-target paths. So in terms of predictive coding, if you want to implement this in the brain in a ML model where you have these sparsely connected regions, you can't afford to pass a loss gradient back through these super sparse, highly compressed, low bandwidth connections. So you have to do something completely different. You have to do something that breaks with the concept of a fully connected model, like a single transformer model, and move to this predictive coding regime. And I wanted to highlight these two particular papers that I think are great recent examples of implementations of predictive coding. And the dynamic predictive coding, I think, captures some important ways in which each of these cortical areas adjusts itself over time based on what sort of signals and noise it's getting, which I think is useful to keep in mind. And this one I think is particularly interesting because it has implications for whether or not this sort of procedure would be feasible and competitive at scale. So I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into the incremental predictive coding. So in the past, predictive coding hasn't been used at large scale because it's very computationally expensive in its traditional implementation. This novel implementation of predictive coding actually is approximately twice as efficient. It approximately uses half the non-parallelizable multiplications of backpropagation. So this is actually implementation of predictive coding that's similarly stable and similarly capable to backpropagation, but twice as efficient. And that's quite dramatic and opens up the possibility for doing this at scale in a way that has never been done before, because previously you saw results where predictive coding failed to really have either adequate efficiency or adequate convergence when used in language model scenarios. We've had better luck with it in visual contexts in CNNs, which are relatively efficient. Here you can see these three lines, the top purple, then red, then green. These are all standard predictive coding implementations. The orange line is a backpropagation implementation. And then the incremental predictive coding is the blue line, which converges faster while still also using fewer multiplications before it gets to convergence. And then this is an example of a language model. BERT is a masked language model that's often used by scientists for small-scale language model experiments because it is much cheaper for an independent lab to run a training run of BERT. BERT is something you can do for $10 worth of compute versus millions of dollars of compute for something like GPT-3 level model. But in this small scale model, we see very promising results where this new implementation of predictive coding has a loss curve that follows very closely along with the backpropagation loss curve. And unlike previous implementations of predictive coding, which never really converge in this experiment and proceed quite slowly and noisily. So I think that this alone suggests that there's the potential for this to become a revolutionary new paradigm in machine learning. But this is just one part of the problem, right? This is how do you handle having these disparate regions that have too narrow of bandwidth to be sending a loss gradient between each other. So they do have error signals propagating, but they need to be doing separate gradients within themselves, being separate models in that sense. So this is an answer to how you can accomplish that. But the answer to how we deal with those sub-agents within the nodes, I think is best answered by this other recent paper. A number of people have explored organizing neural nets topologically, where you get these sub-regions that have specialties. And this relatively recent paper shows very good performance with their implementation of this. And so I think this is an excellent example of what you could combine with into the form of a very general transformer architecture and or confinet architecture if you're doing it for the visual region specifically, and then potentially train this with the incremental predictive coding. So putting the two things together hasn't been done yet, but that's something that I'm exploring. And hopefully this will give us regions in the brain, in the simulated brain, which match the sort of topological organization that we can see in the real human brain. So that's it for what I've got so far. So if you have questions, this would be a good time to ask.
Awesome. I think Zan has a question in the chat, and others feel free to raise your hands. Zan, do you want to pose your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And hi all. I had a question about if you think that other than just functional similarity with the brain, there are any sort of other computational roles that this bottleneck would play as a general sort of computing, as a general form of computation, whether that gives a certain type of inductive bias towards certain types of things or different types of problems.
Yeah, I think that for one thing, it would be extremely biologically expensive for the brain not to have this bottleneck, because these long distance axons need a lot of myelination for the signal to travel efficiently across these long distance regions. And if you want to have these thickly myelinated axons and a bunch of them, you have this problem where packing all that extra white matter in between all the regions pushes the regions further apart, which means you need even more myelination and you have even slower interconnect. And so there's a cost function trading off where the more you connect distal regions in the cortex, the further apart you physically push them by packing more myelinated axons in between them. So I think that there's that cost function, I think, is something that evolution has had to work around. So I think that probably if evolution didn't have that cost function that it was working with, it probably would have gone with more connections than it currently has, is my guess. But again, I think my goal here is not necessarily to make the strongest possible machine learning model, but rather to take a machine learning model and get it adequately functional, but extremely interpretable, because my focus is really on trying to figure out how to make AI safer. Because I think currently we have a lot of mysterious, unpredictable behaviors coming from our transformers. We have a hard time fully getting predictability out of them. And I think that this way we would have much more predictability and control. Marcus, do you have a question?
Yes. I missed part of the talk at the beginning, so you might have mentioned it already, but what we see anatomically is a hierarchical organization. So if you look at the whole brain, you have, let's say, a visual module, then you zoom into one brain region, and then you have modular organization again. And there was a paper a few years ago looking at echo-state networks and training echo-state networks. And they perform better if you start with a modular network rather than a randomly connected network. So it might make sense to say that, okay, if you have 10 different tasks, you start with a network that already has 10 modules, and then you start the training.
Yeah.
And one thing to try would be that we have experimental data. So we have some publications where we basically show the modular organization within brain regions. So we can zoom into the motor cortex. We have multiple modules within the motor cortex. And we're currently testing whether they correspond to functional modules. So whether one structural module based on structural connectivity is responsible for arm movement and another one is responsible for leg movement. But we have the data. If you're interested, we could give you the data and you could test whether this is beneficial architecture to implement your machine learning part.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, I think that's a good point, is that these regions are very much set before any learning occurs. Evolution has settled on this breakdown of brain regions. And we know this breakdown of brain regions from studies of the human connectome. So in my work, I've been actually taking these maps of connectivity made from averaging the connections observed across many individuals and using that to create an architecture that actually does have all these connections with their relative strengths in place beforehand. And that's not something that gets learned. That's something that gets preset. And then the learning is all going to be occurring within the node, within the region. So that model learns to deal with the preset information that is going to be coming into it. And it always will transmit its information out to a preset area. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that this hierarchical organization is preset rather than learned.
Yeah. Okay.
Great. Are there any other questions? Thank you so much, Nathan, for coming on. It was such a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for the questions. And yeah, I'll take a look at your work, Marcus. Thank you very much.
Are you on our Discord? If there are any follow-up questions that people have or any collaboration requests, feel free to email me at Lydia@Foresight or field them in our Discord, or maybe people can email you, Nathan.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to get emails, and I'll keep an eye on the Discord if anyone has some questions, which maybe some people will watch the YouTube later and then have questions if they weren't able to attend currently, and I welcome those questions. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And we'll see you next month, everyone. Thanks. Bye.